Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 206. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Candace Kade about her newest book, Hybrid. It is the second installment in Candace's young adult, near future science fiction trilogy known as the Hybrid series, which she likens to Ready Player One meets Divergent. In Hybrid, we pick up where Book One, Enhanced, left off. The wealthy have enhancements, the poor can't afford them, and the resulting disparity between the two has only grown more pronounced and more dangerous. In Hybrid, Candace takes on the issues of CRISPR and genetic alteration, adoption, and the meaning of family, as well as a bit of fun, including the wonderful celebration of the Lunar New Year. And she admits to torturing her main character, Lee Urban, even more than she did in the first book. Even though Hybrid is the second book in the series, it is really more of an origin story for Lee Urban, as the character struggles with the idea of family, how difficult it can be, but also how hard we will fight to keep it. In this episode, I'll chat with Candace about her writing journey, how her own Lunar New Year experiences made their way into her story, and why the climax for this second book was actually the inspiration for the entire Hybrid series, as well as a few other things coming up. Candace Kade, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So congratulations on making it into the Two Timers Club on the podcast. You were here a while ago talking about your first book, Enhanced. You're back today to talk about book 2 in the series, titled Hybrid. If you don't mind, I think what we should do is start with a bit of an introduction to this series. Tell us what we can expect from this series, these books, who our main character is, and then let's dive in to talk about Hybrid.
Sounds good. Yeah, so this series is called the Hybrid series, and it's a young adult near future sci-fi trilogy. So book 1 is titled Enhanced, and it's a little bit like Ready Player One meets Divergent. So it's set in the Asian Federation in the year 2123, where everyone has genetic enhancements, at least everyone who can afford them. And so in this world, society is divided really sharply by those who have these incredible enhancements, like the ability to breathe underwater, super strength, enhanced intelligence, and then those who are too poor to purchase anything and live in the dangerous and sort of gritty metropolis, the outskirts, where the only jobs available are AI tech training jobs. And so our story is about Lee Urban, who was born a natural, but then is adopted into the high society of the enhanced elite and has to conceal her lack of genetic enhancements, because that would be really dangerous for both her and her family if people found out about that. And of course, this gets more dangerous as she enrolls in Peking University, where there's all enhanced people, and a mysterious hacker tries to target her. So it's a lot of fun. There's artificial intelligent games, there's futuristic motorcycle races, forbidden love. But ultimately, Enhanced is a story about a girl trying to find her place in a world where your DNA determines everything. So that's book 1, Enhanced. And then Hybrid is more of an origin story for Urban as she traces down her birth origins. There's higher stakes, greater action. It builds on all the themes of book 1. It's also been really fun as I get to see some of the early reader reviews, and a lot of people are saying, it's even more of a page turner than Enhanced. So it's really fun that I get to see that momentum continue in book two, which is hybrid.
So the idea for book two, did you have this already planned out when you started writing the series back with book one? Or was the plan just, let me write book one and we'll see where we go from there?
So this series is really interesting because I haven't done this with any other books I've written, but the climax of book two is actually where I started for the whole series. And I won't give it away, I won't give any spoilers, but the climax for book two, I had this idea over a decade ago, and it was so vivid and clear to me that I wrote down the whole thing, several chapters, and then shelved it because I was working on other projects and I wasn't really sure how this main character arrived in this predicament and how she got out of it either. And so since then, it was later on when I picked this story back up that I then started writing book one, figuring out how she got in this situation. And then book three, kind of how does she react to that and how does she recover and what does her life look like after that? So it's interesting because a lot of people talk about how in a trilogy, sometimes book twos can sort of drag a little bit. It almost feels like filler for book one and two. But all my readers are like, this does not feel like filler. This feels very fast paced. And I think it's because I actually started with the idea for book two. It was never an afterthought. It was one of the main components of the entire story.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting approach. Not many series begins with a spark that is actually sort of the middle of the series.
Right. And it's the only time it's happened for me too. Usually I'm sort of a linear author and I don't really just start in the middle. But yeah, this one was very strange. For some reason, I just had that spark and it started there.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Lee Urban, your main character. So she had quite a journey through book one, and it sounds like her journey in book two is even more personal and more dangerous. So I'd like to talk about how you grew that character, how you moved her along, and while simultaneously sort of upping the stakes. So there's kind of two things at play. How do you develop this character, make her deeper and richer and more interesting as goes on her journey, and then how do you torture her more by increasing the stakes?
I love that you say torture her more. It's so true. Yeah. So book one, it's all about Urban finding her place in this society where she feels like she doesn't belong. Like she's a natural living among the enhanced, but she's not enhanced. And when she's with the naturals, she also doesn't feel like she belongs because she's lived with the enhanced for so long. She doesn't know their ways. And that's a very personal theme to me because as someone who grew up in China, and then returned to the US as an adult, I sort of felt like I didn't belong in either world because, I was this weird case of having grown up in China. And so the theme of book one is very much something I wrestled with growing up when I returned to the US. Now, the theme of book two is all about family. So it's about Urban finding her place within her own family because she's adopted and she has an older sister who was adopted with her, but she's enhanced, unlike Urban. And then she also has an older brother who is the Lee's only biological child. And so even among her own family, she feels like she doesn't quite fit because, her older sister has enhancements, but why doesn't she? And so it's her quest to figure out why doesn't she have enhancements? Who are her biological parents? And what could family look like? And so it's this theme that she's wrestling with that does up the stakes because, her family are her biggest advocates who know that she's a natural. And her sister is one of her closest friends. And going off to find her and her sister's biological parents, if they exist, very much threatens the relationship between her and her sister. And so there are a lot of stakes, and it is, going deeper into some of the relationships that are the most important to her.
That's an interesting twist on upping the stakes because usually in stories like this, upping the stakes means bigger chases and bigger things blowing up and more emergencies, and the bad guys get bigger and the things that you lose materially are bigger. But here it's almost as if upping the stakes meant going smaller, making it more personal. So the idea of losing relationships and those intangible things that we all hold dear. It's an interesting twist on and torturing your main character.
And I would say it's both. There definitely are still, the huge races and the bad guys get bigger and explode. There are all those things too. But I think at the end of the day, what's actually most at risk for Urban to lose is her relationship with her family. I think that's something she values and almost takes for granted in book one. And so I think that really does up the stakes, even though, like you said, there are all the chases and the explosions and the bad guys, but I almost feel like those are secondary.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about family because in this book, you're right that she's an outsider within that place which should feel the safest. Her own family. She feels all this disconnect with the people that she loves the most. And you talk about her being adopted and brought in, her searching for her birth parents, trying to find her origins. The idea for all of that, did that come to you in this spark for the climax? Was this always something that you knew you would address in this series, or did that sort of develop kind of as you started writing?
So this is one of the things that came after I had that spark. That spark was, I think, yeah, over 10 years ago.
Mm.
And since then, my parents have adopted two of my brothers. So I have four younger brothers, two who are biological, who grew up with me in China, and then two who are adopted from Ukraine. And so having seen that shift in our family is what sparked a lot of this too, because I love my brothers and they were adopted a lot older in life. Like one of them, the oldest one, Vlad, was about to age out of the adoption system. We got him, I think, right before 17. And so, them coming to America for the first time after living their entire lives in Ukraine and not speaking English, and then joining our family, which not only are they adjusting to American culture, but they're adjusting to our family culture, which is a very strange family culture because we've grown up in China and we have lots of, Chinese tendencies. And so it's sort of this weird mix at first. And it was hard at first, trying to mesh Ukrainian culture and Chinese and American and trying to help them understand English. Like we had to use Google Translate even to communicate with them at first. And so it was really hard. And so this theme of family and how hard it can be, but also fighting for it and the importance of it and how beautiful it can be when you do fight for family is one that's very personal and I think kind of flows into book two of Hybrid.
Well, let's talk about that family dynamic in the book. How does Lee feel about being where she is? I imagine it's somewhat a mix of gratitude and frustration in trying to find her place and not necessarily at her young age understanding where she belongs, why she's there, how she came to be there. But how do you show her growth over the story? Like, how do you convey that she's, while figuring this out, she's maturing and she's learning and she's developing empathy, not only for herself, but for the people who love her?
So this is one of the things I love about writing a series is we get to go deeper with each book and we get to sort of peel the layers back of her relationship. So, in book one, we start to see that not everything is the way that we think it is with her family, right? And yeah, again, I won't give any spoilers, but she starts to peel back some of the layers with her relationship with her parents. That's a big focus of book one. And then with book two, we start to see more of her relationship with her siblings, and that peeled back. And so I love that with each book, I get to go deeper into each of her relationships. And same with world building. The reason I love writing a trilogy is I get to flesh out this world and these characters, and I just fall in love with them so much. It's really hard for me to write standalones because I'm just like, I want to play in this world and these characters are so fun. I definitely want to keep seeing them in this world and seeing how they react to people. And so I think it's almost like a cheat in a trilogy because you don't have to cram so much into book one. And you don't have to leave really important details out. You can leave little breadcrumbs or little hints of what's to come, but then later you can explain them in books two and books three. So I think it's really with each book picking a few of her family members or her friends and starting to flesh those out more and peel back the layers of what that looks like. And then showing how Urban reacts when she realizes some of these things about her closest friends and family and, relationships can change. And so I think just showing all of that.
One of the other things you talk about in the book, or you use as part of the setting, is the Lunar New Year for this world that you have built. I'm curious, what did you borrow from culture, holidays, celebrations that you knew and have experienced, and what did you need to kind of make up to fit into this world?
Oh man, so Lunar New Year is one of my favorite holidays growing up in China. Just the firework display alone, it would go all night long. And leading up to it for a full month, me and my friends would buy tons of fireworks and just set them off every day. And so it was constantly loud, constantly smelled like smoke of fireworks, but the actual New Year's Day was just incredible. The firework display, we would go up onto our rooftop and watch it. And yeah, it's hard to even describe it. I tell people if they've seen the 4th of July, imagine that on steroids. That's kind of what it looked like, especially because you think about, the city I grew up in was Chengdu, which at the time had a population of 13 million. And so, picture like being in downtown New York, everyone is setting off fireworks. Imagine what that would look like. And that's a little bit what it looked like growing up in Chengdu during the holiday. So, there's that. There's the element of, people go back for the holidays. They like to see their family. So there's this mass migration. There's the tradition of giving hongbaos, which is kind of like at Christmas in the US, how we give presents. In China, they'll give these little red envelopes that have money in them to children, which is fun. It's like you get immediately whatever present you want because you have money and you can buy it. So it's just a lot of little fun traditions like that that I really miss in the US. And there's some people that celebrate it, but it's just not the same, right? Like living in the suburbs of Oklahoma City, even if there's some people setting off fireworks, it's not going to be like downtown Chengdu, right? So there's just so many of these fun elements that I miss that I got to write into the story, but then change to be futuristic. So part of the firework display, because the Lees are a lot of them are inventors in the inventor gene pool, they have this amazing tech where their fireworks have the element of smell in it. Or there's like they have competitions and they rate each other's fireworks display, and they have different hollow signs where they hold up different numbers for how each other did because they're very competitive. And so just getting to make everything futuristic with the holidays, instead of just sitting around and playing mahjong, they have like virtual gambling games that they play at their house or different stuff like that. So, yeah, it was really fun to get to take elements of my childhood and the things that I love about the holiday, but then set it in a futuristic world and playing with what that would look like.
You mentioned something interesting about this family's characteristics, genetic characteristics, their gene pool, that they're inventors, they're competitive, that sort of thing. How did you decide upon the characteristics for the family that Lee resides in? And then how did you make her different?
That's a good question. So I don't think it was something I plotted in advance. I usually am a plotter, but for the gene pools themselves, I think they just started to come as I wrote the book. With her dad, he's a very successful businessman and he's had a lot of inventions that have helped him in that arena. And so naturally, he wanted his son to take over his business. And because his son is actually, though, in aqua, so he's able to breathe underwater. And that's because the father has a whole underwater chain of hotels and he wants his son to take over that. And so if he was an inventor, that might be helpful, but everything's already been built. And so he really wanted in aqua would be the best position to take over his business. So his son is actually in aqua, but then Lillian, Urban's older sister, is an inventor and they adopted her because of that trait, because she would fit in the family. And so yeah, I wanted a lot of the families to sort of revolve around one or two, at the max three gene pools, because a lot of times the housing that they have will sort of center around the gene pools they have. So if the family is mostly made up of supers who are, maybe in the military, they have, they're a little bit taller, bigger, stronger, then you might have a slightly bigger house to accommodate that. If you have mostly aquas in the house, you're going to have a lot of different water options. And so I wanted to make sure that the gene pools sort of clumped together so that the housing could accommodate them.
And what are the plans for the series? You said it's a trilogy. So did did you already have book three plotted out before, completing and publishing book two, or did you kind of leave book three alone until you were done with one and two, and then start fresh from three? How did the plotting go? How did the planning turn out?
Yeah, so with book one, what I did was when I was editing it, I took a break from editing it and plotted out book two and then did NaNoWriMo month during November and just pumped out a quick, rough draft, 50,000 words, and then went back to editing book one. And then a couple months later, came back to book two and started writing it. And I did the same thing for book three. So I was writing, editing book two, took a break during November, pumped out a rough draft of book three, and then went back to editing book two, turning it into my publisher. And so, yeah, so book two, that's all done. And then book three is the one that I'm currently editing. So since November, I've had that 50,000 word rough draft, and I've just been editing that. And that process seems to work a lot better for me. In the past, I would write the whole first draft and then, maybe move on to something else. And I just found it was really helpful for me to just write a really rough draft. Don't worry about immediately editing it and polishing it because my brain is just so fried at that point, writing all those words in 1 month. And so for me, it just works really well to take a step back from that, work on something else, and then come back in a couple months with fresh eyes and work on it. And I've realized that's the fastest process for me and works really well. And it helps me not feel pressure with my publisher, knowing that, if I turned book two in and I hadn't started book three at all, sure, I might have a plot or a general idea, but what if I wanted something to be planted in book two? Well, now I don't have the opportunity because I already turned book two into my publisher. So I found it to just help my peace of mind to know I have a rough draft of book three. And in the process, I usually do discover, oh, there's a couple things I need to go back and tweak in book two to make this work. So that's been my process so far, and it works really well.
So I assume you were not afraid of the editing process then. You don't have that animosity towards having to sit down and edit your own work if you begin with a very rough draft, really.
I think, yeah, it does give me more peace of mind because you're not staring at the blank page,
Yeah.
knowing that you're starting from scratch. So I think from that angle, it's really helpful. I do despise the editing process. I mean, the first draft is so fun for me and it takes me, 1 month. So I feel like, wow, I accomplished so much. I wrote the first draft in a month. And then it takes me 11 months to then go through and
Yeah.
fix the messy first draft, right? And so that feels less fun. Like, wow, this is taking me 11 months to clean this up. So it's not necessarily fun for me, but yeah, I wouldn't say I'm afraid of it.
Yeah. It sounds like you've got a system that seems to work, at least when writing books in a series. Do you find that the day-to-day process, planning, the act of sitting and writing, has that changed for you from the early days of writing to now?
I mean, yes, the early days of writing, I was a teenager in high school. And so obviously writing as a teenager and then in college and then in my first corporate career versus now, I'm a full-time writer, full-time mom of two. I think it has looked different in every season.
Mm.
Wrote my first ever novel. It took me 10 years. And, that's a fantasy novel that has still not seen the light of day because, I had to learn all the hard lessons and it was just so painful. I mean, it took me 10 years versus Enhanced was my second novel. And I wrote that one while I was working full time living in Beijing. And that one took me about 3 years and then went to a different series, wrote a different book, and then actually came back, got my book deal around that time. And so Hybrid is the fourth book that I wrote. And that one only took me 1 year to write.
Mm.
So it's just each book has been different. Each book has been a different season of life. But then also just learning my own process. And like I said, with NaNoWriMo, learning how that works really well for me. Having a system of critique partners in place who have taught me so much. That's really helped me. So yeah, day to day has definitely changed depending on the season. But I think overall I have become faster. But, there are seasons that are slower. Right now I have a newborn. And the past 5 weeks, I've not gotten any writing done, but I'm still just trying to focus on sleep right now. So in this season, I'm giving myself grace, right? And so I think seasons, days, they all look different, but
Yeah.
overall, the process is getting a little bit faster with each book.
Yeah. And while you were talking about that, I was thinking for you, what has gotten easier and what has gotten harder? You've been on this journey now a long time. Is there anything that you now think, well, that's much easier? Anything that you now think, wow, why is that so hard now?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think what's easier is just sitting with the ambiguity. I feel like the editing process used to like scare me. I used to sit down, look at a manuscript that wasn't working because your first draft, it's not going to be good, right? And so sitting down with it, I would always be really intimidated and think, can I fix this? Is this going to be a good book? I don't actually know. And now, after having done it a couple times, just having more confidence, knowing, the first draft is going to be terrible. That's okay. I can fix this. And I think also just, yeah, being comfortable with not knowing how to fix it at first. My corporate career, there was just a very clear path to most things. But one of the hardest things about writing, I feel like, is you can read a manuscript and you don't know why it's broken. Is it the plot structure? Is it the character's internal arc? What's broken? A lot of times at first you don't know. And that used to just terrify me at first, but now knowing, okay, I will eventually figure it out, is encouraging. So I would say just that confidence is really helpful, and that's gotten easier. I would say what's harder is writing book 3 and finishing a trilogy. That's something I never done before. I wrote a bunch of first novels in series, which is what a lot of people would recommend if you're querying and trying to get an agent. But now, having a book deal, having to deliver on the promise, having to actually finish that trilogy, that's not something I've ever done before. And so I would say that's hard, is just learning, how do you land a plane? How do you make sure all the threads, all the subplots, all the arcs, all these things have a satisfactory ending?
Well, what are your plans then post book 3?
I'm still figuring it out. I have, a couple books that are in various stages of rough drafts or revision on the back burner. I also, I'm always brimming with new ideas, shiny new ideas that I'm already dreaming about. So I don't know. It's just a matter of, I think, picking one and running with it. But at this point, I'm honestly not sure which one it will be.
Yeah. Well, maybe after more sleep,
Yes.
the idea will come to you.
Although I don't know, the sleep deprivation, I'm like drunkenly tired. Maybe my best writing will come out, I don't know. No filter. We'll see.
Well, if people want to learn more about you, the books, find out when you're having new releases, what's next for you on the horizon, where can they go to find you and that information?
They can go to my website, CandaceKade.com, and sign up for my newsletter where I have updates on my upcoming releases. I give away a lot of arcs and have book recommendations and other bookish giveaways. They can also interact with me. I'm pretty interactive on Instagram, and that's just Candace Kade Author. So I would say one of those two places. And then Enhanced and Hybrid are both available just anywhere books are sold, in ebook, and hard copy, and audio format.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Candace, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Hybrid. And we'll look forward to book 3 and the wrapping up of the trilogy. We'll hopefully see that soon. And congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much for having me, Stacy.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, Browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.